Welcome to the series My Stirling Single. This is part 25, refitting the rear wheels and completing the painting of the chassis parts. That's not absolutely true because I still do have some more painting to do. But there is a limit to how many painting videos I want to make in one series. And just for a change, I'm going to start this episode by showing the refitting of the rear wheels. This is a fairly simple operation, making sure that the axle boxes are the right way round, because on the axle boxes at the top they have an oil hole and at the bottom they have a threaded hole which takes the suspension. In this clip I'm currently refitting the horn keeps or horn stays, whatever you wish to call them. Each one of these is held in place to the frames using two 5BA bolts. Now it's time to fit the suspension. This takes the form of a threaded rod fitted with two lock nuts on one end to hold the spring in position. When I fit the horn keep on the other side, you'll see it more clearly. At the beginning of this sequence, I showed a pot of Loctite 243, and Loctite 243 is not a retainer like 603, it's just a thread locker. In this sequence you can clearly see the arrangement and how things go together. The piece of threaded rod with the spring on it just goes through the hole in the horn keep and screws into the axle box. When I dismantled this part of the engine and removed the suspension, I was quite surprised to find that these two pieces of threaded rod with the lock nuts on the end that hold the springs in place were very loose. And this is a very bad situation because if you're running down a track and one of these fell off, it would probably derail the locomotive, which is something that you really don't want to do. Many years ago I had a serious derailment on a 7 1/4 inch gauge ground level track, and the damage to the engine was extensive. It even broke one of the wheels. Now it's time to fit the water pipe which feeds water to the axle pump. A quick word about piping miniature steam locomotives. If a pipe goes from point A to point B, it must not touch anything in between. It's obvious that it mustn't touch any moving parts because the moving parts would soon wear through the soft copper. But also copper piping should not touch any part of the chassis, because the chassis itself will vibrate as the engine runs down the track, and any corner parts of the chassis, in time, will wear through the pipe as well. So in this case I'm being very careful to make sure that this water pipe touches nothing at all around the suspension area. Now it's time to fit the footsteps. I sprayed these parts in an earlier episode. The paintwork doesn't look too brilliant, but then again it's under a very, very bright light, and also it's a highly magnified image. When I turn out the bright lights so that I've only got ambient light in the room, everything looks a lot better. Here I have a little bit of a problem. When the locomotive was built, someone drilled all the way through the block, and the left-hand bolt goes all the way through the block into the frames, and the head on the left-hand bolt is much bigger than the one on the right-hand, or at least it was before I ground it to the same shape. I didn't do this very scientifically. I could have done it using the milling machine, but it was hardly worth it. I did it by eye on the 1-inch belt sander. Once again, in this extremely magnified view, I'm touching in the paintwork using some Great Northern Railway's chocolate brown. I didn't bother using any etching primer because in this position the bolts are out of the way completely and will never be touched. And besides which, this paint sticks quite well without any primer. Where possible, I always use the same paint, Phoenix Precision Paints. It's good stuff. Turning the engine round, you can see on the other side that both of the holes in the aluminium block are threaded, so it's just a case of fitting two short 5BA bolts. And during the fitting of these bolts, I'm trying really hard not to scratch the paintwork. I'm controlling the socket so it doesn't touch the main footstep. I don't think it would make a really bad mess of the footstep if the socket did touch the paint, because the paint on these spray painted footsteps is quite hard now, as I painted them a few days ago. That's one bolt tightened, now over to the other one. I didn't tighten them initially, I screwed them into position and then went back over the job and just nipped them up a little bit more to make sure that they were both tight. And in exactly the same way as you've just seen on the other side, I used some chocolate brown paint and a very small paintbrush to touch in the bolt heads. This clip is running at 4 times normal speed because I definitely can't paint this fast. And now when I pull the camera back to a reasonable distance that's not quite so magnified, as you can see, the paintwork looks a good bit better. The wheels look like new, and at least the frames are the correct colour now. In the last episode I showed this clip. I was painting some etch primer over the top of the JB weld that fills the bolt heads on the smoke box. I only did this to give me some indication of how much more I need to rub down the JB weld. And then I changed the paintbrush for a special unpainting brush and removed the paint. In conclusion, this showed me that I needed to rub down the JB weld quite a lot more before I paint it. In this clip I'm painting the copper piping to the injectors. To stop the paint from going everywhere, I've fitted a plastic bag between the piping and the frames. The first part of the job is to paint the copper piping using etching primer. And in case you're wondering why I've waited until now to paint the copper, the reason is that it's no good painting the copper piping and then bending it to shape, because the paint would probably crack. I painted the water pipe to the injector before putting it back in position. So that's both sides painted, now it's onto the buffer beam. Before painting the buffer beam, I removed the hook in the centre, and then I thoroughly cleaned the buffer beam with some Scotch-Brite and panel wipe. And now in this clip I'm painting the buffer beam using some etching primer. It's really very important to use etching primer. So what is etching primer? It's a special paint that contains an acid that etches into the metal, so it sticks to the metal a lot better. Before I paint the buffer beam red, I need to know which red to use. Do I use buffer beam red or vermilion? Luckily, today's the day that Simon is delivering my traction engine, so as Simon is an expert in all things to do with locomotives, I will ask him what the colour should be. That concludes this episode. Please stay safe and stay well. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website. Click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you will find it very easy to find other videos that you may like to watch.